pregnant, whipped, and hunted through the woods. A Lakota chief hid her and gave her sanctuary. The fire had burned down to coals when I heard her. Not footsteps. You don't hear footsteps when a person's been running in wet grass for hours. What I heard was breathing, the kind that comes from somewhere below the chest, lower than the lungs, pulled out of the belly by terror and cold, and a body that has no more left to give. I knew that sound. I'd made it myself once in a ravine up near the Yellowstone when a Crow War party had us pinned 3 days without food. A man breathes like that when stopping feels like dying. I was sitting outside my lodge, couldn't sleep. The council had been hard that week. 2 of my headmen wanted to push south toward the Platte, and I knew what was there, and I'd said so, and nobody liked hearing it. Nights like that I sit outside and let the cold do what it can. The sound was coming from the tree line east side of camp, the pines that run down toward the creek, about 40 yards. I didn't call out. I didn't move right away. I just listened, because sometimes what sounds like a person in the trees is a person who's followed by other people, and you want to know if you're hearing one thing or two before you go walking toward it in the dark. What I heard was one thing. I picked up my rifle and walked toward the tree line. She was on her knees, both hands pressed into the mud, head down. Her hair was loose and soaked and hanging in her face. She had no coat. The dress she had on was cotton, a plain working woman's dress, dark-colored so I couldn't see the stains on it at first, and it was torn at the shoulder clear down to the sleeve seam. She was breathing in those deep grinding pulls I'd heard from 40 yards away. I stopped about 10 feet from her. She looked up. What she did in that moment, I've thought about it many times since. Most people, they look up and they see me standing there in the dark holding a rifle and they scream or they scramble backward or they go completely still with the kind of fear that shuts a person down like a lamp. What she did was none of those things. She looked at me and I could see her deciding something. Like she was running a calculation that the rest of her body had no more strength to run. And then she just stayed there on her knees and didn't move. I said in English, "Who's behind you?" She said 4 men, maybe a mile back, could be less. I said, "They armed?" She said, "Yes." I looked at the tree line behind her and then I looked at her and then I looked down because I could tell now from the way she was kneeling, one arm tucked slightly under herself, that she was carrying a child, well along, 6 months, maybe 7. I said, "Can you walk?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "Get up and try." She got up. It took her a while. When she was standing, she swayed once but caught herself. She looked at me with those same eyes she'd had on the ground, measuring, deciding, and then she said, "Are you going to help me or are you going to send me back?" I said, "Come with me." I'll say this about her, she came. Her name was Nora Hale. She told me that much in the first hour, sitting inside my lodge by the rebuilt fire, while Red Willow Woman, my sister's daughter, who had been my housekeeper since my wife passed, brought her a blanket and some dried meat broth and looked at me sideways with the expression that meant she had opinions she was keeping to herself for now. Nora Hale, 24 years old, 8 months gone, not 6 like I'd thought, a rancher's wife from a settlement called Cutbank, 50 miles east of where I sat. She drank the broth and said nothing for a while, just let the warmth from the cup do what it could, and I watched her hands. They were bad. Both of them, the knuckles split and the heels scraped raw from the ground. The shoulder of her dress where the tear was, underneath that tear was a welt that ran from her shoulder blade down toward the small of her back. I didn't look directly. I'd seen it when she sat down and her back was briefly to me. It was a whip mark, thick and dark and 2, maybe 3 days old. I sat across the fire from her and let her be for a while. After maybe half an hour she said, "The men behind me, will they come into your camp?" I said, "Men like that don't come into my camp." She looked at me. I said, "Not more than once." Something shifted in her face then. Not relief, exactly. Closer to the look a person gets when they find out the ground under their feet is harder than they thought it was. like she'd been testing it for so long she'd forgotten what solid felt like. I asked her who put the mark on her back. She said, "My husband's brother." I waited. She said, "My husband died in September. Fever. The land was in his name and it passed to his brother, Thomas Hale. Thomas Hale is the man with the 4 riders behind me." I said, "He wants the child." She said, "He wants me gone. The child, he says it isn't his brother's. He says I was unfaithful and the child proves it, and he told the whole settlement that, and then he said he was going to drag me to the county seat and have me put in a house of correction and the baby given to a church." She stopped, put the cup down. Her hands were shaking, but she had the shake controlled, tamped down to a small tremor in her fingers. She said, "I ran." I looked at the fire and thought about Thomas Hale and his 4 riders standing in the morning dark at the edge of my camp. I said, "Sleep now, I'll set a watch." She said, "Why are you doing this?" I looked at her. I said, "Because you're here and they're not inside my camp yet." That was the first night. I want to tell you what kind of man I was at that time, so you understand what this is. My name is Chayton. My father was a war chief in his time, a man the whole band followed without question, a man who walked into rooms the way a stone walks into still water. Everything moves, nothing forgets. He died when I was 22, a raiding party, and I carried that for a long time. Spent the next several years making myself into something that could hold what he left. By the time Nora Hale came out of my tree line, I was 47 years old. I had been band chief for 19 years. I had fought the Crow and a season of fighting the army and the long grinding peace talks after, and I had watched the world shrink around my people the way a hide shrinks in the sun, slowly and then all at once. My wife, Wachui, had died 4 winters before. We had a son, Tokala, who was 22 now and living near the northern camp. We had a daughter who died in her 3rd year. We had between us a life, and when Wachui went, I didn't fall apart. I just got quieter. That's the kind of man I was. Not a man who carried his wound loud, a man who did the work regardless. What I had not been in a long time, not since Wachui, and before her not since I was a young man, was needed by one person in the way that Nora Hale needed me on that first night. Not needed by a band, not needed as a symbol, not needed as a chief to make decisions. Needed the way a tree is needed when the wind is killing you. The way a wall is needed. The way ground is needed when you've been running for your life and your knees are giving out. I didn't think about that at the time. I just set the watch and went to my own blankets. But I'll tell you, it was there. Thomas Hale came at dawn. He came with 3 riders, not 4, so somewhere in the night he'd sent one back, maybe for more men or maybe just because the man had lost his nerve in the cold. Hale himself was big, thick through the shoulders, a man who'd been strong in his youth and let himself go soft around the middle without admitting it to himself. He had a broad hat and a rifle across his saddle, and the look on his face was the specific look of a man who believes he has a right. I was standing at the edge of camp when they rode up. Just standing. I had my rifle in the crook of my arm but not raised. I had 6 warriors visible, and I knew there were another 4 in the tree line he couldn't see. He pulled up about 20 yards from me. He said in a loud voice, the voice of a man performing for his riders, "I'm looking for a woman. White woman, dark hair, pregnant. She come through here." I said nothing. He said, "She's my property, my brother's widow, got herself in trouble and ran off. I'm here to bring her back legal." I said, "She's not here." The lie was simple and complete. I delivered it the way I delivered every word to men like that, without inflection, without apology, looking directly at his face. He stared at me. His jaw moved a little. He looked past me at the camp and then back at me. He said, "I got a right to search." I said, "You don't." He said, "Now listen here." I said, "You're on Lakota land. You came without invitation and you're speaking to me about rights. You have no rights here. You have the right to turn your horses around and ride back the way you came." The three riders looked at each other. One of them was maybe 20 years old, and he was already looking at the way out. Hale said, "You're harboring a white woman against her will. That's a federal matter." I said, "Then go get a federal marshal. Ride 50 miles east, get your marshal, come back with paper that means something. Until then, you're a man on my land with a rifle across his saddle, and I'm asking you to leave." He held there for a long moment. The kind of moment where a man is deciding how much his pride costs and whether he can afford it this morning. He couldn't. He said, "This isn't finished." I said, "Ride east, Thomas Hale." He knew his name from her. He heard that and his face changed, and then he turned his horse and rode, and his 3 men went with him. I stood there until they were out of the tree line. Then I went back to the camp. Red Willow woman was standing just inside her lodge flap watching me. She said, "In Lakota, he'll come back with more men." I said, "Yes." She said, "So what are we doing?" I said, "Keeping her here until she's safe to move." Red Willow woman looked at me with her sideways look. She said, "And when will that be?" I said, "When I say so." She made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite the opposite and went inside. Those first days, Nora Hale did not behave the way I expected. I had formed a picture in my mind those first hours, a frightened woman. A woman who would be grateful and quiet and would sit in the lodge wrapped in the blanket Red Willow woman gave her and wait to be told what was happening. That was the picture. The picture was wrong. On the second morning I found her outside, early, before most of the camp was moving, crouched next to the fire pit I used for the morning meal, trying to restart it herself. She had no flint, and she was using a stick and a dry piece of barkboard, and she was doing it wrong, but she was doing it with the focused, irritated concentration of a person who does not like being useless. I stood behind her for a moment. Then I said, "Tilt the barkboard." She stopped and looked at me over her shoulder. I said, "You've got the board too flat. Tilt it up toward you, let the air under." She tilted it. I said, "Faster with the stick." She went faster. The ember caught. She sat back and looked at it, and then she looked at me and said, "Thank you." Then she said, "I'm not going to just sit in there. I need to be doing something. I'll go crazy." I said, "What can you do?" She said, "I can cook, I can sew, I can pull a straight line. I was a farmer's daughter before I was a rancher's wife." I said, "Red Willow woman will find you work." She said, "Tell her I don't need minding, just give me the work." I told Red Willow woman. Red Willow woman said, "In Lakota, she said that herself." I said, "Yes." Red Willow woman looked over at the woman crouched by the fire. She made the sound again, that not quite sound, and then she said, "Fine. Here is something I'll tell you that I've never told anyone directly. I am not by nature a man who notices things gently. What I mean is my attention is built for threat, for ground, for where the wind is coming from. I read landscape, I read men. I don't read the inside of a face the way some men do, the way my wife could, the way she used to say, "Chayton, that boy is carrying something," and she'd be right about a sadness in someone I hadn't seen at all. But in those first days with Nora Hale, I found myself noticing things I had no use for. The way she worked. She had a specific rhythm, quick and then slower and then quick again, like she was always thinking 2 steps ahead and her hands had to wait for her mind to finish. When she wasn't sure how a thing was done, she watched whoever was doing it until she understood, and then she did it herself without asking. She didn't perform cheerfulness. If something was hard, she showed it in her face, but she didn't make sound about it. The child, her belly, was something she managed rather than accommodated. She moved around it with a practical, brisk efficiency, not gracefully but not gingerly either. She slept long in the mornings, which Red Willow woman approved of. She ate everything she was given. On the 4th day, she started learning Lakota words from the children, who found this funny enough that they followed her around in a small troop, calling out words, and falling over themselves laughing when she said them wrong, which she took with the even temper of a woman who has decided she doesn't have the luxury of pride. I watched all of this from whatever distance a chief can watch from and told myself I was keeping account of her situation, the way I would keep account of any guest in my camp. That was what I told myself. The real trouble came on the 9th day. I had sent scouts east to track what Hale was doing, and they came back with news I'd half expected. He'd gone to the county seat, and he'd gotten a man named Deputy Colton to ride out with him, and they were coming with a paper that claimed Nora Hale was a fugitive from a legal proceeding regarding the disposition of the Hale Ranch and the paternity of her unborn child. Paper like that was trouble, not because it was right, it wasn't right, and every man in the territory who dealt with those proceedings knew how they worked, but because it gave men like Hale the ability to call other men out to help him, made it a legal business. And legal business between white men and my camp was the kind of business that could go sideways into something much bigger than one woman and one rancher's brother. I sat with my headmen that night. 2 of them said the same thing: give her up. Give her up, the child comes out white, she goes to the county proceedings, maybe it's bad, but it's not our bad. We have enough bad. I listened. I let them say all of it. I respect my headmen. These were not cowardly men, they were careful men, which is a different thing, and they'd earned the right to say what they said. Then I said no. Broken Bow, who had been my headman longest, who had stood beside my father and then beside me for more years than I could count on 2 hands, looked at me and said, "Tell me why." I said, "Because she came to this camp and asked for shelter, and I gave my word." He said, "You didn't give your word. You just put her in your lodge." I said, "That's the same thing." He was quiet. I said, "If I hand this woman to those men, what am I? What is this camp? A place that shelters people only when it's easy. We do that, we stop being what we are." The fire moved. Broken Bow looked at it. He said, "The deputy will be a problem." I said, "I know." He said, "How big a problem do you want this to be?" I said, "However big it has to be." He made a sound, almost like a laugh. He said, "You sound like your father." I didn't say anything to that because there was nothing to say to it except thank you, and that would have broken the register of the conversation. I went to Nora Hale that night. She was still awake, sitting up by the banked fire in her lodge. She'd been given a lodge of her own by then, a small one near the center of camp, and she was doing something with her hands, a piece of mending, but she wasn't really looking at it. When I came in, she set it down. I sat across from her. I said, "Thomas Hale is coming back tomorrow with a deputy and a legal paper." She didn't flinch. She said, "What kind of paper?" I told her what the scout had said. She sat with it. The fire made small sounds. She said, "If you give me up." I said, "I'm not giving you up." She stopped. I said, "But I want you to understand what's coming, and I want you to hear from me directly what I've decided. Not hear it in confusion in the middle of what's going to be a tense morning." She said slowly, "You're not giving me up." I said no. She looked at me for a long time. She said, "That paper could make real trouble for you, your camp." I said yes. She said, "You know that." I said, "Nora, I know that." She sat there and did the thing she'd done at the tree line, that calculation, that running of numbers. Then she said, "He'll say the baby is proof I was unfaithful. He'll say that to the deputy. He'll say it to the magistrate if it gets there. He's been saying it everywhere he can say it." She stopped. Then she said, "The baby is my husband's and mine. He knew it was his. We had been—" She stopped again, and this time she was pressing her lips together, and I understood she was managing something that was going to break through whatever she'd built around it. She said, "Robert was a good man. He wasn't much for fighting, and he was sick for a long while before he died, and Thomas never respected him for that, called him weak. But he was a good man, and the baby is his." I said, I know. She said, how do you know? I said, because I have ears, and I know what kind of man Thomas Hale is. She looked at me. Then something in her face broke open, not all the way, not into crying, but open the way a door comes open when the latch finally gives. She said, I haven't had anyone just say that. Since Robert died. Everyone in Cutbank took Thomas's word because Thomas had money and Robert was dead and I was just the widow with the round belly and no proof of anything. I said, you're not in Cutbank. She said, no. She looked at me. No, I'm not. There was a long quiet, the fire. Outside the lodge a dog moved through camp, soft footfalls in the grass. She said, Chayton. First time she'd used my name. She'd been saying Chief, until then a little formally, the way people do when they're not sure of their standing. She said, Chayton. What are you going to do tomorrow? I said, stand at the edge of camp with my rifle in my arm, and tell a deputy of Borough County that the woman he's looking for isn't here. She said, but I am here. I said, yes, but you're a guest of this camp and you are under the protection of this camp, and that paper he's carrying doesn't change what land he's standing on when he delivers it. She was quiet a long time, then she said, and if he pushes it further than that? I said, then it gets further than that, but tonight you sleep. She looked at the fire, then she looked at me. She said, why does a man like you? She stopped. I said, ask it. She said, why does a man like you help a woman like me? You don't know me. You lose nothing by letting those men take me. Less trouble for everyone if you just. I said, Nora. She stopped. I said, there are things I do because they're the right thing, and there are things I do because they're the right thing for my people, and most of the time those things are the same. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes a man has to just be what he is. I looked at the fire. Now sleep. She didn't say anything. When I stood to go, she said my name again, quietly, just the once. I stopped with my back to her. She said, thank you. I went out into the dark and stood there for a while and looked at the stars. The deputy's name was Colton, a narrow man, older than Hale, with a long mustache and the measured eyes of someone who has been in enough bad situations that he didn't go looking for more. He came in the morning with Hale and 2 other men, and from the way he sat his horse, I could tell that he had opinions about this errand that differed from Hale's, and that those opinions were private. I stood at the edge of camp, same place as before. Broken Bow was to my left, 2 steps back, which in the language of my camp meant he was backing my play without being the one who started the conversation. Colton pulled up. He said in an even voice, you're the chief of this camp. I said, yes. He said, I'm Deputy Colton, Borough County. I have a paper here regarding a woman named Nora Hale who is. I said, I know what the paper says. He paused, then he said, so you know she's here. I said, I know what the paper says. He looked at me. He was measuring, not stupid. He said, Chief, I'm going to be direct with you because I think that's the most useful thing I can do here. I have a legal instrument. I have an obligation to serve it. What I don't have is a want to turn this into a bigger situation than it has to be. I said, then we want the same thing. He said, tell me what you want. I said, I want you to go back to Borough County and tell the magistrate that Nora Hale is under the protection of this camp, that she is 8 months along with a child and is not in condition to travel, and that she will appear before any legal proceeding voluntarily, with her own counsel, in 60 days, after the child is born, and she's had time to recover and find a lawyer who isn't Thomas Hale's drinking companion. Colton looked at Hale. Hale's face had gone red. Hale said, that's not. Colton said, quiet, Thomas. To me he said, she's told you she'll appear voluntarily. I said, she has. He said, and you'll put your word to that. I said, you have it. He sat there. He turned the paper over in his hand once, looking at it. He said, the 60 days. I said 60 days, with her own counsel. He said, I'll need that in writing. I said, come back tomorrow, I'll have it written. He looked at Hale again. Hale was building up to something, and Colton shut it down with a look that had years of practice in it. Then Colton looked back at me and said, Chief, I want you to know I'm taking your word as a man, if she doesn't present herself. I said, she will. He nodded slowly, then he said, Thomas, we're riding. Hale said, this isn't. Colton said, Thomas, we're riding now. They rode. I stood there until they were gone, and then I let out the breath I'd been holding since they came into view. Broken Bow said, beside me in Lakota, 60 days. I said, yes. He said, the child will be born by then. I said, that's the point. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because that's where the real story is, not the men on horses. The camp had a rhythm, and Nora Hale found her way into it with less friction than I'd expected. Part of that was Red Willow Woman, who was sharp and efficient, and had no patience for weakness of will, but a great deal of patience for genuine effort, and Nora Hale was nothing but genuine effort. Part of it was the children, who had adopted her somewhere in the second week as a kind of gentle, slow-moving novelty that was good for games, and who called her Pehinsapa, black hair, which she learned the meaning of and wore without complaint. She learned things. She watched everything and asked direct questions and didn't pretend to know what she didn't know. She learned which plants Red Willow Woman used for which things. She learned to soften hides, badly at first and then tolerably well. She learned about 30 words of Lakota well enough to use them, and about another 20 that she used wrong in ways that were funny enough that Red Willow Woman started correcting her with something approaching warmth. I watched all of this, I told myself, because a chief watches his camp. And I told myself other things too, in those evenings when I found myself sitting near her fire without exactly having decided to go there. I told myself I was checking on her welfare. I told myself I was keeping an account of how much longer before the 60 days were up and what arrangements would need to be made. I told myself a lot of things. What was actually happening? I think I knew it, and I let it be without naming it. The way you let a thing rest in a dark room because you're not sure yet what kind of thing it is. She talked to me in those evenings. The way she talked was direct and thoughtful, and she didn't fill silence with noise, which I valued. She told me about Robert, her husband, Robert Hale, not with grief exactly, more with the gentle sadness of someone who has already done most of the grieving and is left now with the clear shape of who the person was. She said he was quiet and funny in private and stiff in public, and he'd loved his horses with a depth of feeling that embarrassed him a little. She said he'd been sick for almost a year, and she'd nursed him through it, and she didn't regret any of it, and she missed him. She asked me about Wachui. Nobody asked me about Wachui. People in my camp knew, and they were respectful of the knowing, and nobody asked. She said, what was she like? I said, why do you ask? She said, because you're a man people respect, and I'm curious who made you that way. I sat with that. I said, I made myself that way, most of it. She said, sure, but a woman who loves you right changes something. I said, yes. She said, what was she like? I thought about how to say it. I said, she was stubborn and she was right about most things, and she never let me get away with being less than I could be. She had a sense of direction like a hawk. She always knew which way was north. In 30 years I never saw her lose her way in the dark. Nora said, that's a beautiful thing to say about a person. I said, it's just true. She said, still. The fire moved between us. She was mending something again. She was always mending, and her hands moved without her looking at them. The child moved inside her. I could see it from across the fire, the small shift in her posture, the brief pause in her hands, the way she'd put one palm flat on her side, the way a person presses a door that's creaking, quietly, without thought. I said, does it hurt? She looked up. I said, the child moving, Does it hurt? She said, no, not yet. A pause. It's strange. It's like being a house with someone living in it. I thought about that. She said, does that sound? I said, no, it sounds right. She smiled then. Not the careful smile she'd worn the first days, the smile that was also a weapon, also a shield. This was different, quieter, caught off guard, just a real smile in the firelight. I looked at the fire. The child came in the 5th week. Earlier than it should have, though not badly early. Red Willow woman said 7 months but healthy, which was better than 7 months and the other thing. She came at night, the way children do, and there was about 4 hours of hard work that I know only the periphery of because I was outside. Broken Bow sat with me, and we didn't talk much, and the fire we had between us was small and practical. About an hour before dawn, Red Willow woman came out and said, a girl, small but loud. I said, Nora. She said, tired, fine. I sat with that for a moment. Red Willow woman looked at me. She had known me since she was a child. She looked at me, and then she looked at the lodge, and then she looked back at me, and she said, in Lakota, Chayton. I said, don't. She said, I'm not saying anything. I said, good. She said, only that a lodge with a woman and a child and a fire, that's not the worst thing. I said, Red Willow woman. She went back inside. Broken Bow, to my left, made a sound that might have been a cough. I said, not a word. He said, I'm sitting here cold and quiet. I went in to see her the next morning. She was propped up with a rolled hide behind her, and the child was in her arms, small, red, tucked against her, with the concentrated fury of a new thing that isn't sure yet about being in the world. Nora looked like a woman who had been through a war, which she had, and she looked at me when I came in with eyes that were wide and raw and present. I crouched down beside her. The child was asleep. The small mouth was working slightly, the hands fisted. I said, what's her name? Nora said, I don't know yet, I've been trying to decide. She looked at the child. She said, I thought about naming her for Robert, a version of it. She was quiet. But I think she needs her own name, something that isn't about what she came from. She looked at me. Is there a word in Lakota for something that endures, that comes through hard things and stays? I thought about it. I said, Wassenhinsha, patient one who endures. She said it back slowly, getting most of it. I said, Watchin, and I said the whole word again. The second syllable hit right. She said it again, better. She looked at the child. She said, Wachina, a softening of it the way mothers do. I'll call her Wachina for a milk name. I looked at the child. I said, it's a good name. Nora looked at me. She said, Chayton. Her voice was different. The thing she'd built to stay upright, the practical efficiency, the direct eyes, the willingness to work and not be looked after, it was still there. But there was something else behind it, exposed a little by the night and the rawness of the morning. She said, I've been trying to think how to say this, and there isn't a right way, so I'm just going to say it. I waited. She said, you could have let those men have me. On the first night, you could have let the deputy take me. There were a lot of places you could have made the easier choice. And you didn't. And I know, she stopped, started again. I know you're a man who does what he thinks is right. I know that's what you'd say it is. And I believe that. But I want you to know that there's a woman sitting here right now who knows she'd be in a house of correction, and her baby would be gone, and her life would be something very different and much worse. And that woman wants you to know that you are. Her voice did a thing. She held it. She said, you're a good man. Whatever the world out there is saying about what it means, what men are, what you are a good man, and I know it and I won't forget it. Ever. I stayed where I was, crouched next to her for a moment. The child slept, the fire breathed. I reached out and I put my hand over hers, the one that wasn't holding the baby. Just rested it there, the way you rest a hand on ground you trust. Her hand turned slightly and her fingers came up around the side of mine. Not a grip, just a hold. I said, "Rest now." She said, "Stay a little longer." I stayed. The 60 days came. I had written the agreement as Colton asked, and I had kept my word, and Nora had spent those 60 days writing letters, long, careful letters, with red willow woman's traded ink and paper, to a lawyer in the territorial capital named Aldicott who had a reputation for taking cases the county magistrates didn't want to hear. He wrote back. They went back and forth. She dictated some of what she wrote to me when she couldn't find the right word for a legal thing, and I'd spent enough years dealing with treaty language that I knew how those words worked. We went to the county seat together. Me, Nora with the child, broken bow, and 2 warriors who rode with their rifles visible, because I saw no reason to pretend we were coming as supplicants. Thomas Hale was there with his lawyer, and a face like a man who'd expected this to be easier. Aldicott was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a very quiet voice, which I found I respected immediately. The proceeding took 2 days. I will not give you all of it because most of it was the grinding machinery of men arguing over paper, and the grinding machinery of paper is dull. What I will tell you is this. Nora Hale stood up in that room and answered every question in the direct, undecorated way she answered every question in my camp, and the magistrate, who was not Thomas Hale's drinking companion, who turned out to be a man named Reese who had the look of a man tired of Hale-shaped problems, listened. And Aldicott put before the court the letter from Robert Hale, dated 6 months before his death, in Robert's own hand, saying that his wife was with child and that the child was his, and that in the event of his death, his wife was to receive the southern parcel of the ranch and the house standing on it, which was her property and had been since their marriage, and which Thomas could go to the devil about. Thomas's lawyer argued about the letter's authenticity. Magistrate Reese asked Thomas, in a very flat voice, if he was prepared to claim his brother's handwriting was forged. Thomas was not, apparently, prepared to claim that. The case was settled in Nora's favor on the 2nd afternoon. The southern parcel and the house, Thomas Hale to have no further contact with Nora Hale or her child. She stood outside the courthouse afterward in the cold, Wachina wrapped against her chest in the way red willow woman had taught her, and she looked at the street with the expression of a woman who is standing on ground she has just confirmed is solid. I stood next to her. She said, "It's over." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have a house. I have land." She said it like a person who is testing the sound of something true. I said, "You do." She looked at me. She said, "Chayton." She said it the way she'd said it in the lodge with Wachina in her arms, like the word itself meant something else. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "You go to your house, you put it in order, you raise your daughter." She said, "And you?" I said, "I go back to my camp." She looked at the street again, a long quiet. Then she said, "The house is 50 miles from your camp." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's not so far." I looked at her. She looked back at me with the direct, measuring eyes she'd had at the tree line. She said, "A woman alone on a ranch in this country, a woman alone with a daughter, she needs allies. People she trusts." I said, "Yes." She said, "I trust you." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not." She stopped. She said, "I know what it is and what it isn't, and I'm not asking for what it isn't. I'm saying I'd like to know you're there. I'd like to know when the spring comes that there's a reason for you to ride that 50 miles. I thought about the spring. I thought about the camp and the long quiet of my lodge in the evenings after the fire burned down. I thought about the sound of her voice, plain, direct, never decorated. I thought about red willow woman saying a lodge with a woman and a child, and a fire is not the worst thing. I said, "There will be a reason." She let out a breath she'd been holding. She said, "Good." We stood there in the cold street while Broken Bow and the warriors waited with the horses, and Wachina made a small sound against Nora's chest, announcing herself to the world. I put my hand on the small of her back, brief and plain and steady. She didn't move away from it. She leaned toward it just slightly, the way a person leans into warmth. Then we went to our horses and rode north, and the cold came in from the plains the way it does, smelling of dry grass and distance, and I rode in the front and she rode just behind me, and that was how we left that town. The spring did come. I rode the 50 miles. I will tell you about what I found when I got there, because it tells you something about who she was and who she was becoming out on that land. The house was repaired. She'd gotten 2 men from a settlement 10 miles over to patch the roof and rehang the door, and she'd done the rest herself. The south fence was mended. The kitchen garden was planted, not yet up, but you could see the turned earth in straight rows. A milk cow was in the small paddock out back, a good-looking animal, brown with a white forehead. She was in the yard when I rode in, holding Wachina against her hip. The child was 4 months old now, fat and awake, looking at the world with the concentrated seriousness of a person who is taking inventory, and she was arguing with a man about the price of seed corn. The man was twice her size and clearly frustrated, and Nora was not backing down an inch. I stopped my horse and watched. She said a number. He said a different number. She said her number again with a patience that was clearly its last reserves. He tried the big number one more time. She pointed at the road. He looked at the road. He looked at her. He looked at me, large on horseback, arriving, and then he looked back at her. He took her number. She thanked him pleasantly, and he left. She turned to me. I said seed corn. She said he was high by 40 cents. I said I know. She said well. I got down from the horse. She walked toward me, and Wachina reached out both her fat hands in the way babies reach for what they want, and I took her, the baby, and held her against my chest, and she made a satisfied sound and grabbed my shirt. Nora watched me hold her daughter. She said in a quiet voice, "She knows you." I said I know. She said she stopped. She said she's been calm all morning, like she knew someone was coming. I looked at the child. The child looked at me with Robert Hale's dark eyes in a face that was already its own thing, nobody else's. I said, "I'm going to be here for a while." Nora said, "How long is a while?" I said, "I haven't decided." She said, "Red Willow woman won't mind." I said, "Red Willow woman packed my things." Nora laughed. Real laughter, the kind that surprised her. She put her hand on my forearm, just rested it there, and she looked at me and I looked at her, and there was no performance in it, no asking, no uncertainty. Just 2 people who had come through something hard and were standing on the other side of it together. She said, "Come inside, there's coffee." I followed her in. The door swung shut behind us. Wachina made a noise of approval. Outside, the spring light sat on the turned earth of the kitchen garden, and the cow moved in the paddock, and the south fence held, and the land lay out flat and quiet under a sky that didn't care one way or the other, which is the only sky that's honest. That was how it was. That was how it stayed.